The 2020 presidential election is just days away, and Americans everywhere will soon be deciding who will lead the country for the next 4 years. President Donald Trump and former Vice President Joe Biden are hoping to earn your vote as the nation deals with a global pandemic, issues stemming from systemic racism, among other issues. The presidential election is the biggest race, but there are also races at the local and state levels that are arguably just as important. This year, more than a third of eligible voters will be from the Gen Z and Millennial generations, and despite being one of the largest voting demographics, we rarely hear what they think is important. Until now. Tonight, we will hear from experts and activists along with Generation Z and Millennial influencers to talk about the issues that matter to Americans.
Talk to me. All right, here we go. Hi everyone, it's your girl Amara La Negra and welcome to Fuse Town Hall. Our votes matter. We all know that we are living in an extraordinary time. In 2020 alone, we have experienced a global pandemic, nationwide protests as a result of injustices to our communities of color, meaning people like myself, and continuing climate crisis. Added to all of that, a presidential election that is going to take place in just a few days. Americans are making a huge choice, and it is important that we are as informed as possible on all the challenges. In efforts to bring as much awareness as possible to a variety of issues, Fuse has brought together a collection of voices that represent wide ranges of ideas and perspectives. Tonight, I'll be having a virtual conversation with a number of contributors as they take us through each individual issue before you head to the voting booth this fall. They'll also be focusing on how you can get involved on a more personal level with your local elections and organizations to make a big impact on the America you want to see and live in for your future. Family separation, deportations, and an unfinished wall at the southern border have become hallmarks of a current presidential administration's policy on immigration. There have also been attempts to end DACA, which is a system that allows certain undocumented immigrants who arrive in the U.S. as children to be protected from deportation. Immigration issues took center stage in 2018, when families coming into the U.S. seeking asylum were separated at the southern border. Here to talk about the immigration crisis is Sara Mora, who uses her large social media following to inspire change. Hey Sarah, thank you for talking with us.
Hey Fuse, it's great to be here.
All right, Sarah, let's get into the conversation. You use social media pretty often and you're pretty popular. How do you use your platform to call attention to the challenges faced by undocumented people?
I use the platform by making sure that I emphasize individuality, because when I came out as undocumented, I realized I did it also inspired by so many people in California, where there was so much history around workers' rights and farmers' rights that had already been speaking out about being undocumented. And so I use my platform by emphasizing the power of individuality, but also more than the power, the critical urgency to decentralize narrative around migrant communities. And I started something called Population Mic that I'm slowly developing, but it's an ecosystem in a way to highlight and really be a microphone for actions locally, nationally, and globally around migrant rights, and really sharing a sense of the fact that when we help, we are literally contributing our grain of sand to a larger community, because it doesn't take one person, it takes a collective effort.
You posted a picture recently that said undocumented and not illegal, and there were a lot of mixed reactions in the comments. What was your intention of the post, and how did you feel seeing all the reactions?
I just feel like the more disconnected you are from migrant communities, the more entitled you feel to calling people illegal. So it was really hurtful to feel like that there was a need to post that. But I feel like amongst the many things that hurt, why not add something that is really going to make people think about when they use that word, and how objectifying it is to refer to human beings as illegal, but be so quick to hire the same immigrants that the conversation is about for any and every job.
You recognize the struggles that come with being undocumented firsthand, and you know a lot of people that are going through it right now as we speak. How has COVID-19 been affecting the undocumented community differently than other communities?
In the beginning, I'm not sure how differently, to be honest, but I do feel like in the beginning, we were having so many conversations about how COVID literally just exposed what our undocumented community has been going through, where it's like before people were scared to go to a hospital because of legal status and because of not having insurance. And so this just made everybody's worries in the community intensify so much more, having to depend on the same institutions and government leaders that attack and really are responsible for the killing of our community.
What sort of immigration legislation would you like to see passed in the future?
I think it's really one thing, like a pathway to citizenship. There's people that have been here for over 30 years working and hoping. So I think whoever gets elected should be pushing for a pathway to citizenship and for everyone. It's not just for DACA recipients. There's TPS, there's H4, there's refugee status. The mess that the government created has to be fixed. I think there's just like such a misconception about migration, and we don't talk about, which is why I love diplomacy. Like, whoever gets elected must have that diplomatic mind and must accept the reality of how the U.S. has contributed to the violence in countries abroad and has influenced the turmoil that people have to feel their countries about. So pathway to citizenship is really not negotiable. I think that's the option.
How important is it for young people to get out and vote?
It's important for young people to get out and vote because even though so many of us cannot relate to endorsing any candidate, we know that there are slightly clear, emphasis on the slightly, reasons why certain candidates will more obviously support communities that we belong to. So it's really important for us to use any chance we get, even outside of voting, but in this chance we're talking about voting, to do that.
Thank you, Sarah, for talking to us on these important issues. The truth of the matter is that undocumented people bring so much value to this country. They contribute to so many different areas in this country. And, with this pandemic, I know that they're struggling and I know that they're really going through it. So I hope that we can see some change in the future.
Thanks again, Fuse.
Joining us now is María Teresa Kumar, who is an Emmy-nominated contributor with MSNBC and a voting rights activist. You do a lot of work specifically for the Latinx population all over the country with your organization, Voto Latino. Why is it so important for these younger generations of Latinx voters to hit up the polls?
Well, this is what's exciting. For the very first time, young Latinos are going to be the second largest group of Americans that are eligible to vote in this country. And 15 million of us are not registered. So that is our biggest challenge, is to close the voter registration gap. Because once we register, we vote. It just happens that 4 million more young Latinos are going to be eligible to vote this election. And for the first time, this generation of young Latinos are part of the largest generation of eligible voters in our nation's history.
Wow, that's incredible.
That's political power. So if you believe in climate change, and if you don't believe that we should be under lockdown in a pandemic because we need to get leadership back in order, if we believe that we need to have access to good health care and that we have to address racial inequities, we need to register and vote to actually change the political power.
What is at stake for undocumented immigrants in the community in November? Why should people care?
16 million Americans live in mixed status households. That means that some loved one, either directly that you live with or that your neighbor lives with, because we all know them, they don't live separately from us, will be impacted by an administration that has decided to be cruel. There is no reason that we have detention systems built for children. We developed the laws of refugees and asylums that are practiced around the world, and we are breaking them every single day. For no reason. We have to return to becoming compassionate and fair and recognizing each other's humanity. The tears of an immigrant or an undocumented person is no different than ours or someone else's. And they wake up every single morning dreaming the same dreams, which is having a fair shot. If you care about police reform, if you care about whether or not you are in a sanctuary city or not, whether you're not racially profiled, judges, but more importantly, district attorneys, make the decisions of whether or not a low-level offender will get prison time or not, whether our young kids will get pulled over, and whether or not they get community service or juvie. The most important piece that you can do is, yes, register and vote during the presidentials because we need you, but pay attention to the local stuff. And think about running for office yourself. Because what I do know about the young Latino community is that we have been leaders in our household for long before we turn 18 years old. We have been helping our family navigate the country. Sometimes we take on 2 jobs in order while we're in school just to help ends meet, not for ourselves, but for our family.
So what's at stake for DACA recipients these upcoming elections?
Freedom. Honestly, it's the ability to live and thrive in this country without anxiety, with able to actually fulfill your dreams. Often, I mean, the fact that the Supreme Court is now in a battle, it's because it's a battle for our values. Sadly, we have 6.8 million Americans that have suffered COVID. We know that once people have struck with COVID, many of us will suffer pre-existing conditions that unless we have a strong healthcare system, we may not be eligible for. In the Latino community, the stakes couldn't be higher because sadly, while we are 20% of the population, we are over 30% of the casualties. Our population is young, we are hungry, we want to contribute to this country, but we need to be able to have access to healthcare and good education so that we can compete equally regardless of the zip code we were born in. That's what we want. But that only happens if we participate. So for the DACA recipients, I know that you may be tired, you may be anxious, you may be hurt, but I also want you to know that it was you all who gave so many millions of Americans courage to march, to register, to vote. Because while you do not have that voting power, you chained yourself to fences, you mobilized your allies, and the fact that we know who you are is because you activated a segment of Americans who had no idea.
Thanks, Maria, for sharing with us the importance of the Latinx vote.
Awesome. Thank you so much for your time, you guys. Thanks for doing this.
This community has a lot of power next month, and it's necessary for us to flex our, our political muscle. So you already know we have to definitely go out there and vote. Latinx people, get it together. We can all agree this year has been challenging. One of the biggest moments that inspired a massive movement is the killing of George Floyd in Minnesota. But this isn't a new phenomenon. The fact is, African Americans and other minorities are killed by police at a higher rate, sometimes 4 times higher than whites. The whole world saw this unfold through Floyd's death in Minneapolis back in May, when a white police officer kneeled on his neck for more than 7 minutes. Floyd's death sparked protests around the country and brought renewed attention to the high-profile death of other Black Americans, including Ahmaud Arbery, Breonna Taylor, and many others. The Black Lives Matter movement is a cry for help, is a cry for justice. We have seen it on social media, we have seen it in the news, we have seen it everywhere, and we continue to ask for justice. With us now is lifelong South Central LA resident Pete White, who's the founder and executive director of the grassroots organization LA Community Action Network. Hey Pete, it's great to have you on today.
Amara, thanks for having me. I'm really happy to be here today.
I want to start by asking, what kind of issues are Black people in Los Angeles and elsewhere facing when it comes to systemic racism?
Amara, I'm headquartered in Skid Row, right? And Skid Row is known for largely one thing. It's really known as a destination for poor and houseless people, right? But when we think about, in the work that I do, when I think about Skid Row and I think about houselessness, I can't think about houselessness without thinking about deindustrialization and the impacts to the Black community. When I think about houselessness in Skid Row and Black people, I cannot think about it without thinking about the war on drugs. In California, 26 prisons, right, were started with that. And so you can't talk about systemic racism and impacts of the Black community without talking about the political decisions that have led to it. When you think about houselessness in Los Angeles, 1 in 22 African American men in Los Angeles, houseless. 1 in 47 African American women in Los Angeles, houseless. That's compared to 1 in 272 all other races and ethnicities, right? And then when we continue to go down the list of the health of African Americans and poor folks, right, we are on the bottom. There's no way to talk about systemic racism without pointing to the role of government.
You are a supporter of Measure J in Los Angeles County. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Amara, yes, steadfast supporter. I'm on the campaign committee. We are really, really excited about Measure J. I mean, in short, what Measure J does is it reallocates nearly $1 billion away from things that criminalize our communities and towards things that really make us safe, right? And so when we think about the social determinants of safety, we're not made safer because we invest more monies into the police. We're not made safer because we create more jail beds or prison beds, right? We're made safer when everyone has a place to stay, right? When healthcare is available for all, when everyone has access to healthy food, right? These are the social determinants to safety.
What's your argument against people that say that we shouldn't defund the police?
Yeah, I'll tell you this, Amara. Groups like mine have been fighting to reallocate resources away from the police and towards the community for decades, right? And so when you use the word defund, of course that's charged language. But what we're really talking about is reallocation. Let me give you a real quick story. So in Los Angeles in 2017, on the city side, not the county side, Los Angeles spent $100 million on houselessness, right? On providing services and the like. Guess how much of that $100 million went to policing? Don't guess, I'll tell you. $80 million. Now, what that says is we made a full-scale investment in a police department to cure the housing crisis, right? And so we need to reallocate that money away from policing, which has never created a bed, which has never created housing, and move it into line items that actually get people off the streets. And so we don't talk about defund. We talk about reallocation. We're saying that we cannot sustain budgets that continue to grow for the militarization of policing our communities at the expense of those things that keep us healthy, safe, and alive.
Are you a supporter of the Black Lives Matter movement, and why?
Amara, of course, right? I think the Black Lives Matter movement is my birthright, right? I'm a student of civil rights. I'm a student of the Black Power movement. I'm a student of the Black Panther Party. I'm a student of the Chicano rights movement. I'm a student of AIM, right? The Black Lives Matter movement and sort of the political activity we see on the ground today is something that I've dreamt of my entire life. I believe that once we acknowledge a problem exists, it's what Soledad brother George Jackson said, that we are duty bound to do something about it. So as far as my role in the Black Lives Matter movement, my role is wherever I am needed. And so when we think about the movement, I've been on the front line of protests. I've been in the back rooms of developing strategy. I've been on the front lines of communications, right? I've helped build resources. Anything that I need to do is the place where I belong in this movement. And so, yes, I am a steadfast supporter. Our organization is in steadfast solidarity, and we are part and parcel in the engine that drives this movement.
Are people around South Central LA supportive of the Black Lives Matter movement?
When we saw millions of people in the street, those are millions of people from all over Los Angeles, right? From all 5 districts, from all 15 council districts saying that Black Lives Matter. And so our communities are supportive.
How important are local elections in the fight against racial injustices?
Yo, Amara, you just got all the questions today, don't you? So for us, our orientation is think global, act locally, right? Local elections are the most important elections that you can participate in, right? And so here in Los Angeles, we were just talking about Measure J, right? Nearly $1 billion that's going to be moved toward things that are going to make our communities. I come from South Central Los Angeles. That $1 billion can make South Central Los Angeles and the outcomes a whole lot different, a lot better for us, right? And so always think globally, act locally. And so, this election, get in there for the national, get in there for the judges, but definitely let's get down on the local elections because that's where you are going to feel the most change. Proximity is your friend.
Why should young people, specifically young people of color, get out and vote?
Young folk, through the annals of time, have always been the leaders of movements, right? And so I say to young folk, yes, y'all need to hit the polls, right? But change is not an episodic thing that happens every 2 or 4 years, right? So in addition to voting, because your vote does matter, and if your vote didn't matter, we wouldn't see number 45 in the White House today doing everything that he can to disenfranchise the votes in our community. Doing everything, right? Everything from putting in new postal masters to removing machines. That's because your vote matters. But in addition, and just as important, not as important, just as important, it's making sure you are activated, connected to organization and organizing throughout the year, right? Change is not episodic. Change and revolution happens every day. And so, yes, get out to vote because it is hella important and folks are trying to convince you that your vote and your voice does not matter. It does. But just as importantly, get out there. You can join organizations like ours because we are going to get that bag. We are going to make sure that we are reallocating resources to the things that keep us alive, keep us healthy, and keep us on the move.
Pete, do you have any final thoughts?
We are targeting reallocating resources from the police towards things that really make us safe, right? That's the kind of reform we're looking at. We're saying that at a time, there has been a curve, right? There's been a 20-year curve of crime coming down. The police department actually admits this. They will say, yes, crime has plummeted and the role of the police has changed, right? And this is where we get into the police department themselves say, our role now are the role of counselor, the role of substance abuse counseling, the role of teacher, the role of coach. We say none of those are your roles, right? Your role very clearly was around crime. And seeing that crime is plummeting, let's make sure we reallocate those resources towards things that make us safe.
Thank you, Pete, so much for joining us today. You gave great information. Thank you for continuing to bring awareness. And the truth of the matter is that we need more leaders like yourself who support racial justice and make positive changes. Thank you so much for being such an inspiration.
Amara, thanks again. Really thank you for allowing me to participate in this conversation today.
From being banned from military service to gaining marriage rights across the country, the LGBTQ+ community has come a long way in their fight for equality. Now, some of their rights are at risk. One example is that over the summer, officials moved ahead with a rule that would write transgender individuals out of protection against sex discrimination in healthcare. Some good news is that studies show most Americans now support the LGBTQ+ community. Joining our conversation is Ingrid Duran, a former Marine whose work in the LGBTQ+ and Latinx communities has been recognized with national awards. Hey Ingrid, thanks for joining in.
Thank you for having me. It's an incredible honor to be part of this amazing town hall.
Ingrid, I want to start by asking, what sort of work is your company doing to address the LGBTQ+ and Latinx issues?
So in 2012, we founded a public education campaign called Familia es Familia with about 24 national Latino organizations. And it was focused on 4 pillars, on family unity, anti-bullying, discrimination, and marriage equality. And when we were successful in passing marriage equality federally, we swapped out that pillar for trans issues. And we've continued to do that work both with our nonprofit partners and also with Latino members of Congress and members of Congress from the Black and Asian caucuses as well.
Do people who identify as LGBTQ+ and Latinx face unique challenges?
Absolutely. I think, when you look at our kind of conservative Catholic families or faith-based families, there are a lot of struggles and challenges for Latinx youth who are coming out. And many of them end up on the street because once they tell their story, their parents aren't accepting of them. But what we did find when we started this campaign and what really helped with marriage equality was storytelling. And when we had folks tell their personal stories and appeal to people to change their hearts and minds, it really did work. And that's how you saw the shift in the polling around marriage equality in America go to almost 85% when it finally passed the Supreme Court.
Have you seen these issues get better or worse?
They did around marriage equality when that passed in 2015. And I think since then, under this administration, we have seen an attack not only on Latinx people, but also on the trans community. And I think, when you look at Latinos overall and our general kind of success under this current environment, it's been really challenging. And I think there's been a lot of issues with Latinos being detained at the border, Latinos being attacked by ICE. There's been trans issues with folks who are detained under ICE. So I would say that as of late, things have not been great for Latinx LGBTQ youth or the community in general.
Have you seen views of the general public shift towards the LGBTQ+ community in the past few years?
In 2015 we did when marriage equality was passed. And I think, again, going back to storytelling, that is what really changes hearts and minds when folks in I think it was 2016, my wife and I did a documentary called The Trans List. And it was following the Latino list and the Out list, which were all identity-based films where individuals would tell their story about whether it was, if they were Latino, we had Justice Sonia Sotomayor tell her story about how she got to where she is on the Supreme Court. And we did the same with the Trans List and the Out List. And it was those stories, I think, that really impacted folks. And when they're able to watch it without kind of their attack mode on, and when they're able to watch it in their own home and really hear the stories and hear what people are saying about their coming out process, and they understand that they're no different than 5 minutes before you found out they were LGBTQ. They're the same individual, they just have a different story and they're struggling with their story. I think that really does change hearts and minds, and it makes a difference. So yes, it's vital that Latinx folks tell their stories and that they speak out.
How important are local elections in the fight for equality for the LGBTQ+ community?
Local elections are incredibly important, and they set law at the local level until there is a federal precedent. So in any, different community, you could have different laws that discriminate. And one of those things that we saw was the, I think they called it the cake law, where, someone didn't want to bake a cake for an LGBTQ couple. That eventually went to the Supreme Court. But, if you don't have elected officials who support the community, then you could have a lot of different laws in different locales that hurt the community. And so it's really important that folks get involved locally, that they know who their elected officials are, that they know where they stand on issues that are important to them, and that they vote. I mean, I cannot stress the importance of voting, especially this year. Every year is important, but this year it has, I think, life-altering consequences for the LGBTQ community and the Latinx community in particular.
Ingrid, what is at stake next month?
Our lives are at stake, our livelihoods are at stake. If you look at, access to health care, if you look at economic issues, if you look at social issues, you look at the kids who are being separated from their families and caged, and the Latinas who are being given hysterectomies against their will, basically being sterilized. I mean, there are so many issues that are at stake that you cannot kind of put a price tag on how important this election is and the kind of consequences it will have if this administration is allowed to stay in for another 4 years. It's horrendous. And if we don't think it can get any worse than it already is, we are dead wrong. It absolutely can, and it will. And that they're going to change things, I think, that will change the direction of this country for decades to come. And it's unfortunate.
Thank you, Ingrid, so much for talking with us today.
Thanks again for having me.
The LGBTQ plus community continues to face challenges every day, but voting people into office who really cares about them is crucial. Decisions on issues like gun control start at the local level. Many people think that you need to vote every 2 or 4 years on important elections, but the truth of the matter is, important elections happen every year. Nationwide, only about a quarter of eligible voters cast their ballot in the typical municipal elections. These elections end up deciding how much money the city spends on things like policing and social services. Our next guest is 19-year-old Marcel McClinton. He has tons of knowledge on both of these issues, and he ran for a city council seat in Houston last year. Hey Marcel, I am so excited to talk to you today.
Thanks so much for allowing me to be here. I'm happy to join you today.
The first thing I want to talk about is you survived the mass shooting incident in 2016 at a local church. How did that experience affect your decision to run for office in Houston?
So in 2016, I was teaching Sunday school class to a room full of toddlers at church, and just after 10 in the morning, we heard that there were gunshots outside in the parking lot, and what we found through hours of locking down the church, I was in the front lobby between 2 walls with about 8 other guys. Watching the shooter pace the parking lot, listening to a police scanner where I heard that my now friend Denise was shot through her car door multiple times. So there was a gunman with an AR-15 who had went on a shooting rampage Sunday morning, and it was tragic. Through over a couple of years after that happened in 2016. 2018 was the Parkland school shooting. It was really watching them, and the Pulse nightclub shooting, the San Bernardino workplace shooting, and every shooting that we see on the news, in our local news, in our communities, where a toddler finds a gun in the home and shoots themselves or a friend. Or the suicides by gun, which is what we mainly see here in Texas. That's 2/3 of gun violence in the state of Texas. It was all of those issues, building up in my heart and making me more pissed off at the system, that really pushed me to then run for city council. I had served on the mayor's commission and task force to prevent gun violence in the city of Houston. And I felt a true passion and desire to serve the people of my city, to increase young voter turnout in the city of Houston, and to hopefully inspire others across our state and the country to just step up and run for office. It can be school board, city council, state legislature. Just step up to the plate and throw your hat in the ring, because you have nothing to lose.
Now, what did your experience running for city council teach you about the importance of being involved in local politics? I'm sure you learned a lot in a short amount of time.
Yeah, local politics is exciting. Politics is politics. Campaigning is emotionally and physically draining. But if your heart is in the right place and you truly want to serve your community, and you believe that you can be a true light, and share a bright vision for the future of your community, you should do it. And so I deeply believed and still believe those things today. Politics is politics, and some days on the campaign trail, you're like, you want to just go home and sleep, or you wake up really, really tired, and I would go to the coffee shop and get a nitro cold brew or two, and then go back for lunch, and then back before I went home, to stay caffeinated and energized. It is a task, that being an activist and engaged, member of your community, there's things weigh on you. I know that when I was when I was just quote unquote an activist in my community, I felt re-traumatized sometimes by hearing the detailed accounts from my friends, in the gun violence survivor network and circle. I would hear tragic stories of how many times their children were shot, or their memories of hiding under bodies in a building where a shooter has shot their friends, or their partner. And those things are hard to hear, and they're hard to keep with you when you go to sleep, as you're also fighting your own traumas and experiences. But it is worth it, and people have to do it so we can make change in this country.
Gun control is, of course, one of your biggest motivations to run for office. Why do you think is one of the bigger issues in this year's elections?
Gun control is a big issue in the 2020 election because more and more people keep dying every year. And I think more Americans have become upset at us, apparently supposed to accept the status quo, and accept the notion that a corrupt organization like the NRA, if we could even call it an organization now, has been laundering money, has been cheating their way with GOP elected officials and lawmakers to allow dead bodies to pile up in our streets. Third Ward here in Houston, it is a bright and culturally loving place, but it's been plagued with gun violence at the same time. Cities like Baltimore and Chicago and rural Texas, where people are shooting themselves because they lack access to mental health care. These things are unacceptable, and we should be asking the real question, which is, what is the root of gun violence to begin with?
Why is it so important for young people specifically to go out there and vote? I mean, it's their future, right?
It is, yeah. I mean, the future is ours, and I complain all the time that we've been handed down, I think, possibly the worst package of garbage that a generation can be handed when they enter the real world. But young people in Texas, I'll speak to Texas again. We saw almost 600% increase among young voters in the 2018 midterms when Beto O'Rourke ran for U.S. Senate in Texas. That is huge. It's incredible. And it's also just a starting point where we're seeing young people who are waking up to this moment and understanding that if we don't shape up right now in November, we may not have more elections to vote in. We may not have a starting block to make impactful change if we're fighting to rebuild a republic and to reform a democracy. So I think young people understand that. The folks who I'm friends with and the young people who I talk to understand what is at stake in this upcoming election. But we're seeing the trends up. Young people are going to turn out in mass. The youth have got the power. And the way we make ourselves an electoral threat, like an electorate that is threatening to the establishment, is by turning on the switch that has already been built for us. Building youth power in U.S. politics is not complicated. It's just a system that has to be turned on, and I think it's already been turned on. And any other time, I think in our country, we probably wouldn't even be talking about the need for young people to turn out, because it would be a giveaway that youth are not going to vote in the election. But everyone's talking about the youth turnout because they know it's going to be massive, and it will be impactful, and it will be life-changing for so many Americans across our country.
Thank you so much, Marcel, for your time. I really hope that you're right and young people turn up to the polls next month.
Thanks again for having me.
This country needs to hear from everyone, especially the youth. Longer heat waves, stronger storms, and mass migrations are expected to become the norm without actions on climate change. Last year was the second hottest year on record globally and the hottest year ever recorded for oceanic environments. It's not all bad news. Scientists agree it may not be too late to avoid or limit some of the worst effects of climate change. Another piece of good news is that young people today care more about the environment than the previous generation. Our next speaker is Dr. Mustafa Santiago Ali, who worked with the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency for more than 2 decades. Hey Mustafa, thank you so much for being here.
I appreciate being here with you.
But you worked at the EPA for many years, so you know what's going on around the country. What are some of the clues Mother Nature is giving us to let us know something needs to change?
Well, we have these incredible sets of climate emergencies that we're dealing with. We have the wildfires that are happening in places like California and, in Washington State and Oregon that are historical. I mean, literally the incineration, of just huge areas across, those respective states. And then, of course, afterwards, the flooding, and that happens because of the rains that will eventually come. And then, of course, we're dealing with hurricanes. We've got these just historic hurricanes that continue to happen time and time again. If we look at the most recent one, that was, in the South, you have historical flooding that is happening. It's literally taking away people's wealth and taking away their lives at the same time. And we still have folks who are denying that these things are happening. And then if you look in the middle of the country, we've had the flooding that's happened with the farmers, and they're losing not only their crops, but their livelihood.
When you travel across the country and you give talks, you mention that environmental issues disproportionately affect poor and minority communities. Can you tell us why that's the case?
Well, communities of color, lower wealth, white communities, and indigenous brothers and sisters have always been the dumping grounds, the sacrifice zones, if you will, for everything that nobody else wants. And a part of that is these fossil fuel facilities that are located in black and brown communities. And inside of those facilities, they are playing a role not only in making people sick and taking and shortening their lives, but it is also playing a role in the warming up of our planet. And unfortunately, these are the voices that have often been unheard and unseen. And what you'll find is that their exposures that are happening from the pollution that's coming out of these plants is also causing chronic medical conditions. And these chronic medical conditions are making people more vulnerable to COVID-19. And the reason is because we have these cancer clusters inside of our communities. We also have liver and kidney disease at an extraordinary rate. And of course, we have lung diseases along with a number of others that, are literally making it so that folks can't breathe. So when we say I can't breathe, that's real in our communities. It's not a slogan. It is literally, we can't breathe, whether it is policemen putting their knees on our necks, or the pollution that's coming out of the plants, or COVID-19 suffocating us. We've got a triple whammy effect that's happening inside of our communities.
Are politicians doing enough? Do you think that this is a priority for people that are in power?
Well, I think the question is, is it a priority for us, right? Because sometimes we forget that we have power unless we give it away. And our power is directing politicians. They work for us. They are utilizing our tax dollars. So it has to be a priority for them if it is a priority for us, and if we hold them accountable. And if they don't do the right things, then we find somebody else who actually will. So if we look at the polling for Democrats, then we know that environmental justice, we know climate issues are a priority in this cycle that we find ourselves in. For independents, they also are very concerned about the issues that are going on with climate change and some of these environmental rollbacks that are happening. And we hope that there is an evolution that will happen with our Republican brothers and sisters, and that they will also find these issues to be critical to not only the health of our communities, but also the health of our economies. So there is a cultural shift that is happening in our country. And the answer is yes, these are priority issues.
Why should people get involved in local politics? We know a lot of the focus is happening around national politics, but why should people get involved in their own communities?
Oh, it's extremely important to be focused on the local level. I mean, many of the impacts are actually happening in people's backyards, on the schoolyards, close by, if you will. So you have to, one, prioritize the issues that are going on locally, because you can create those local solutions, which are actually, in many instances, easier to do than on a national scale, and definitely much more easier than on an international scale. You also can get more intimately involved with the local officials there. Sometimes you're looking at folks on Capitol Hill, you might see them once a year, even when they're representing you. But you're going to see that local councilman or that county commissioner on a regular basis. So, building those authentic partnerships or holding people accountable when they're not moving in that direction is super critical. Being able to marshal the resources and to build those partnerships with all kinds of different folks.
The election is coming up fast. What do you want people to know before they hit the polls?
Your vote is so powerful. There's a reason why people try and stop you from voting. If it didn't matter, if it didn't have any value, they'd be like, y'all go ahead, y'all vote. Shoot, if you want to vote a couple times, go ahead and vote, because it doesn't matter. Your vote is powerful, but you got to utilize that vote. And you got to realize that your vote is tied to your environment. And once again, that tying it to your environment, your vote can determine who are the judges that are inside of your community on the local level, the county level, the state level, and the federal level. So all those judges, whether we're talking about, the locking up of black and brown people, or if we're talking about judges who are actually analyzing environmental laws and various climate-related aspects to law, it is all tied together, but it goes back to your vote. Your vote is also connected to resources and money and where it's going to go and who is going to represent you. Your vote has so much power.
Thanks, Mustafa, for being here with us today. Listening to all these different crises that are going on really put things in perspective.
Thanks for having me. I appreciate being here.
We're now joined by Julian Brave, NoiseCat, who has advised government officials on racial justice and climate policy. He's also a champion on indigenous rights and helped craft the Green New Deal. Hey, Julian, it's great to have you on.
Thanks, Fuse, for having me.
Julian, I want to start by asking you, what kind of issues are indigenous communities facing today related to climate change?
So indigenous peoples are facing both the extractive side of fossil fuel capitalism and the impacts of climate change in the form of wildfires, rising sea levels, droughts, all of that. So on the extractive side, of course, many of our viewers may have heard of the Keystone XL pipeline or the Dakota Access Pipeline, two projects that were built straight through the territories and the treaty lands of Native nations in the United States, and also in the case of Keystone XL in Canada. And those projects, deeply impact not just the treaty rights, but also the water supply and the sort of public health potential for Native communities, particularly in North Dakota and South Dakota and in sort of the Missouri River area.
I know you just mentioned indigenous communities in the Dakotas and in Canada. What are some other communities that are in trouble?
On the west coast of Washington State, the Quinault Nation is going to have to relocate their village of Tahola from the shores of the Pacific a little bit further inland because of rising seas. They're also facing depleted salmon stocks because of the warmer waters of the Pacific Ocean not being good habitat for the salmon, and the salmon is what they've lived on for thousands and thousands of years. In the Gulf Coast, you have communities like the Hauma Nation in Louisiana who live in the bayou and whose land is literally getting eroded at sort of the pace of a football field every single day, and they are also going to have to move their people further inland. And then, of course, further north in the Arctic, Many Inuit communities, native people up at the top of the world, are experiencing global warming at the fastest pace, the fastest rates.
What are Indigenous people feeling about all these changes that they didn't really have a say in? Are they taking action?
So I recently wrote a story for Rolling Stone about what I was describing as the Standing Rock generation. And what the Standing Rock generation is doing is that they are standing up against the threat of climate change, both in the form of fossil fuel developments and extractive capitalism, as well as sort of the impacts on their communities and the political systems that are not working for them, and saying that these things have to stop and that they have to start working to support native life and native rights and native sovereignty. So, one of the more interesting realities of climate change is that while much of society has been complacent, while, social movements have been slower to develop than one might have hoped, very often it is the most forgotten people, native people, indigenous people, who were raising the alarm and calling others to action first. And I think we've seen that in places like Standing Rock, and we're going to continue to see that moving forward as my generation of Native people continues the fight that we've inherited from our ancestors.
You helped craft the Green New Deal to help the country face climate change head on. What do you think needs to happen in order to get such legislation passed?
I think that there is sort of essentially two sides to the conversation on what we need to make a Green New Deal, to make climate action happen in a robust way. So firstly, we need to, invest a ton of money into a clean energy economy in a way that's going to create jobs, it's going to build infrastructure. The second side of this is the part that people don't talk about as much, and that I'll be honest, the Green New Deal hasn't talked about as much. And that's the need to rein in emissions with a combination of performance standards for various sectors and industries, regulations, and also prices that we put on pollution and fees that we put on pollution to be sort of the stick part of that equation.
How important are local elections in the fight for climate justice?
Local elections are incredibly important. I think that very often we are hyper-focused on who's in the White House, and at the end of the day, the person in the White House has fairly minimal power over a lot of these outcomes. Local elections very often determine the built environment of the cities and towns that we live in. One of the biggest drivers, actually the biggest driver proportionally of climate change in the United States, or at least emissions in the United States, is transportation, the transportation sector. And a lot of decisions about transportation, about the way that our cities are developed through zoning, the density of cities, whether they're bikeable, for example, those are decisions that are made at the local level. But very often, actually, people would be probably surprised to learn that many of these decisions can be driven at the local level.
Thanks, Julian, for coming on today. You truly helped highlight the fact that Indigenous communities face a unique challenge with the whole climate crisis. Thank you so much. We truly appreciate you and continue to bring awareness to the world. We are so grateful for you.
Thanks for letting me be on.
Joining us now is Jamie Margolin, who's an 18-year-old climate justice activist. Hey, Jamie, thank you so much for chatting with us today.
Thanks, Amara.
At only 15 years old, you helped start a youth climate action organization. What made you become so involved in the solution for climate crisis starting in high school?
What really made me start to take urgent action on climate at such a young age is that we really are in crunch time. This literally is 0 hour to act on the climate crisis. We have no more time. I kept thinking that by the time I grow up, it's going to be too late. By the time I grow up, leaders are always telling me, oh, when you grow up, you're going to be able to solve this crisis. You're going to be able to, the youth will solve it. But really, by the time that my generation is old enough to be in political power, it's already going to be too late. It was really urgent to solve the climate crisis. We've seen the West Coast on fire. We've seen so many climate disasters, and I grew up seeing them when I was younger, and so I really felt that urgency to act on the crisis as soon as possible, which is why I got involved so young. When I just first started, I was 14 years old.
What kind of work are you and 0 Hour organization doing?
So when I was 15 years old, I co-founded an international youth climate justice organization called 0 Hour, which organizes marches, rallies, mobilizations, summits, etc. around climate action and climate justice. And the work that we're doing right now is the Vote for Our Future campaign. We are trying to get as many people out to vote as possible with the climate in mind. This is a very, very crucial election. The 2020 election is incredibly crucial for the climate. Our planet can't afford politicians who don't take the climate crisis seriously, who don't take action on it. We need to elect folks who are actually going to take real, radical action on the climate crisis, and we can't afford anything less than urgent climate action.
Do you see your peers caring about the environment?
I do see my peers caring about the environment. I feel like a lot of young people do genuinely care about the climate crisis, do genuinely care about urgent climate action, and are really, really mad and infuriated by the state of what is happening and by the way that leaders are brushing this off and not like taking this action. I really feel like there has been there's a huge level of outrage and resentment and just anger and sadness by so many young people who care about this so much, not just out of the goodness of our own hearts, but it's really out of an instinct for survival. How are we supposed to plan for a future that doesn't even exist?
How important is it for young people to actually go and vote in this election and local elections in general?
It is incredibly important for young people to get out and vote in the 2020 elections. We have to elect leaders that we feel will represent our needs, that will solve the climate crisis. And that's not just for the presidential. I really think that there's always a lot of, rightfully so, there's a lot of attention placed on the presidential elections. But this also means down ballot races. This means that young people need to do our research and turn out in massive numbers for the Congress, for the Senate, for local elections, and really making sure that we're electing leaders who will actually save our lives and our futures and our planet and make our lives better, not just around climate change, but around other issues that we care about and that we need change on. So I think that it's incredibly important and that it's crucial that we actually elect people who will have our best interests at heart and actually do what we need them to do.
Jamie, any final thoughts?
I guess one thing I'd like to talk about young people and voting is that a lot of times people like to think of, there's a debate of whether voting is even effective, and it's either voting or this. Voting is not the only strategy for change making, but it is an important strategy. It's not, do we vote? It's voting effective, or is radical organizing effective, or is this effective, or is that effective? All of these things happen together. I don't believe that voting alone is going to change everything. We can't be 100% we elect the right people and everything's going to be okay. There's also other actions that have to be taken, but we can't ignore voting. I feel like that's a very, very important aspect of it, but it's not an either or thing. Voting is just something that you do on the side to ensure that you have the best leadership possible, and then you also work to actually create the change that you want to see.
Thank you so much, Jamie, for being part of this conversation. It's great that you saw a problem and you took action at such a young age.
Thanks for having me.
The need to act now is so important. We really can't wait any longer. And it will be too late for our next generation if we don't do something now. Tonight, we heard from activists and experts from all over the country on many of the issues America is facing today. Whether our guests were talking about racial inequality or immigration issues, they all recognize the need to go out and vote. Voting is a fundamental process in a democratic system, and it is the way to elect a leader who truly has the best interests for us at heart. Young people have the most to lose as well as the most to gain during the next election. Their vote will help decide how our country will be run for the next 4 years. Personally, I really want young people to go out there and vote right now. As we continue to face the coronavirus pandemic, be sure to vote by mail if you can. And if you're headed to the polls, be safe out there and wear your mask. I would also like to give a huge thank you to all of our guests today who have one final message for everyone at home.
You should vote because your lives depend on it.
You should get out and vote because they still let us do it, and I don't know how much longer they're going to let us do it.
You should get out and vote because we can change the world.
You should get out and vote because this is the most consequential election of our lifetime.
You should get out and vote because your voice matters. Don't allow them to steal your voice.
You should get out and vote because our planet depends on it.
You should get out and vote because your vote is powerful and your vote translates into change.